Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Garrity. I am the historian for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and this is the 30th edition of Chebacco Chats. I'm really glad to present today one of my favorite stories in the years I've been trying to understand the history of Mount Desert Island. It's about the Norwood Cove object. And let me get my video set up. All right, I think we're ready now. So the Norwood Cove object is a supposed artifact of an event that occurred over 400 years ago, maybe at Fernald Point, a place on Mount Desert Island that is on the shore of Somme Sound. And it is a place in a story that has attracted many different versions told over the years, some of which are deeply embedded in our landscape with place names like Saint-Sauveur Mountain and Jesuit Fields and the area around Flying Mountain. And what I'll do is I'll just go through all that story and try to put this object in its context. So let's begin with the place name Saint-Sauveur Mountain, the Holy Savior, named to recall the event when a group of French Jesuits came to Mount Desert Island with the intent of establishing a mission. To bring you into orientation, you can see this 1893 map of MDI, and it points to the place where, within a few weeks of its founding, the mission was destroyed by a force of Englishmen commanded by Samuel Argall. Argall sailed from Virginia's Jamestown settlement aboard his ship, the Treasurer. At their conflict, several Frenchmen were killed, others driven away in small boats, and the rest were taken captive to Virginia. Among those killed was Brother Gilbert du Thet, the first Jesuit missionary to die in North America. Islanders have long maintained that the site of the Saint-Sauveur mission was at Fernald Point in Southwest Harbor at the foot of Saint-Sauveur Mountain. The event that we're talking about happened in 1613, but the name of the place, the Jesuit mission, the supposed location at Fernald Point, really wasn't discussed until the 1860s. The location was largely forgotten after the fall of the mission in 1613, and 2.5 centuries passed before the government of Canada published a text titled The Jesuit Relations, a collection of reports of Jesuit missionaries, including an eyewitness to the disaster, Father Pierre Biard, who described the place as a beautiful hill, gently rising from the sea, its sides bathed by 2 springs, and in some places is covered with grass almost as high as a man. He's talking about this location, a place that if you've climbed Flying Mountain, which everyone should do if you can, looks down on the place of the Jesuit mission. And he describes it as a hill gently rising from the sea, with grass sometimes growing as high as a man. And it was placed there by Francis Parkman, or the location was identified. Parkman wrote in 1867, about a mile from the open sea on the farm of Mr. Fernald is a spot perfectly answering the minute description of Bayard. However, there's a problem with Parkman's assertion. While Parkman wrote that Bayard says the place was apart from the island of Mount Desert, he was evidently mistaken in this, close quote. So Parkman's interpretation of the evidence requires his reader to believe that Bayard did not know where he was. But Bayard was very familiar with the geography of the region. He had explored the area on 3 different journeys in 1611 and surely knew exactly where he was. What I'm getting at is that the location is in dispute. Historians have taken sides on its location. Americans like Samuel Eliot Morison and David Hackett Fisher favor Fernald Point, while Canadians like W.J. Eccles and Jean de Langlais favor a site on the mainland, perhaps in Lemoyne. Archaeologists have been steadfast in their agnosticism. No physical evidence that the location was at Fernald Point has ever surfaced, but all we have to go on is the written evidence. So we don't know. However, in the place of solid physical evidence, numerous hoaxes and assertions have been advanced to put it at this location. For instance, there's this map that is in the files of the Maine Historical Society. It was drawn by Father Eugene Vetremille, and it shows the supposed grave of Brother Duthet and the location of the fortress. It's called the ruins of the fortifications. Vetremille even sketched the scene, identifying it in a catechism intended for the conversion of the Wabanaki, that it shows the supposed grave of Duthet and the ruins of Saint-Sauveur. Looking at a close-up of how he sketches this in, he shows this as the ruins of the fortifications. And a note nearby this location in his sketch says, there are persons living on this land who remember this wall about 10 feet high. Well, a few years ago, modern day archaeologist Bruce Bork took out to study this location and see if he could find the ruins of Saint-Sauveur using LiDAR detection imagery and infrared. And we were about to survey the site using ground penetrating radar until a certain photograph came out of the files at the National Park Service at Acadia. It's this picture. This photograph was dated 1857, and it's taken from the top of Flying Mountain. And it shows Fernald Point and a large barn here standing right where the map would indicate the ruins of the fortification. In other words, the ruins of the barn, which apparently burned down between 1857 and 1867 when Vetremille visited, was sold as the ruins of the fortifications. In fact, and this is a little bit of an aside, but if you climb Flying Mountain today, you can see this rock on the trail that goes up the mountain that corresponds with this rock in the image. And one thing to observe is how much the forest has grown up since this time when you could look down on Fernald Point. But I'm pretty sure these appear to be exactly the same stone. Well, that's a little bit of an aside. And the thing is, if we had examined the records and more thoughtfully, we would have recognized that the French never built a fortification. We have Bayard saying, our captain amused himself too much in cultivating the land, while all the chiefs of the enterprise were urging him to get to work without delay upon the houses and the fortifications. They had a choice of making food or making shelter, and they chose food. The whole expedition ended in disaster when the French were defenseless. Bayard writes, from these disputes sprang others, until the English brought us all to an understanding with each other. It was then that Argall came with his ship, firing on the defenseless French, and destroyed the settlement. So time passes. Vetremille's map, produced in the late 19th century, was not the only piece of evidence that seemed to point to the location of the Saint-Sauveur mission. In 1946, a local man named Christopher Lawler gave a mysterious object to the Southwest Harbor Public Library. The librarian who accepted the donation recorded it. She wrote, this dagger, owned by Christopher Lawler, was unearthed by him at a depth of 18 inches, a greater depth than a plow would ever reach. When he was digging a hole in which to plant a tree on his grandfather's farm at Norwood's Cove in 1921. The land on which this dagger was found is not more than a quarter of a mile from the Jesuit meadows on Fertle's Point. It is therefore reasonable to assume that it was once owned by one of the Jesuit group who settled there circa 1613. Well, when this was presented, the local newspaper got hold of it and described it as a weapon of bronze with copper inlays and bears the marks of ancient workmanship. So for more than 70 years, this object has been on display at the library, kept behind glass in a hand-carved wooden case for viewers to wonder if it's an artifact of the Saint-Sever mission. And in the late 20th century, library officials consulted with many experts who to try to definitively determine the nature of this object. Experts consulted included the Winterthur Museum, the Maine Archaeological Association, a armory museum, and they variously hypothesized that the object is an ornamental device used in French Catholic religious ceremonies, a type of spear called a halberd, a pike-like weapon called a spontoon, or even a decorative piece of Americana. The library eventually concluded that none of the assessments were definitive, and they just agreed to call it the Norwood Cove object. And it waited for us a few years later to use tools that are available to us, but not to them, such as the internet. And we renewed the investigation a few years ago with these new resources, search engines, and our ability to put this in front of the internet and ask people to help us solve the problem. So we began to get responses after we posted this. And most of the responses started to help us understand what it was not. The object is not a weapon, though it has a blade and resembles the head of a pole arm like a halberd or a spontoon. Its unsocketed base could not be attached firmly to a pole, nor could it be a dagger because it has no handle, and rather than being balanced, it's offset with a definite front and a back. You see the front side and the back side. Nor could it be 400 years old with a history of being buried in the earth from 1613 to the object's discovery in 1921. It doesn't show the degree of corrosion that you would expect for an iron implement buried for centuries in the salty and acidic soil of coastal Maine. Nor is it a missionary's religious symbol. Such objects as a religious implement would be made in a more refined and ornate style with better materials. We even considered whether it was a finial for a Victorian era fence. And though the object is decorative in nature, we examined hundreds of photographs and catalog images of ornamental fence tops and found nothing that resembled the Norwood Cove object. The thin blade of the Norwood Cove object is dangerously sharp and too easily bendable for placement atop a fence. Such finials as in the Victorian era were typically produced with 3 dimensions to give them a greater strength. Another suggestion is that the object might be part of a fancy crest rail, a lightning rod, or a weather vane meant to be placed on top of a roof. However, we've found no similar examples of such work. Something that seemed plausible to us is that the object might be a letter opener, but even that could not be its original purpose. If it was a letter opener, it would not be a very good one. The handle is short and asymmetrical, and making it awkward to manipulate. Then, as kind of a last resort, we contacted the Museum of the Army in Paris, the Musée de l'Armée, and which, if you visited Paris, I know many people in our audience may have gone to Paris. It's at the Invalides, the place where Napoleon is buried, and it's the place where army artifacts are kept. And we corresponded with the curator of the artillery department at the Musée de l'Armée, Christophe Pommier. He told us what this was. He said that the object is a piece of World War I era trench art formed from the body of a 75 millimeter artillery shell, including the copper belt. This is the copper belt that also appears in fragment in the Norwood Cove object. He noted that the copper belt across the base of the object is still encrusted in the steel of the body of the shell, and the nodes of the copper driving belt were designed to fit into a rifled barrel and cause the shell to spin. And this is the type of gun that was used, a 75 millimeter gun that actually, in the First World War, took on a certain personality of its own, or a certain fame of its own, to the extent that it was used in propaganda postcards. It was known as Notre Glorieux 75, the glorious 75 that that saved France. And the volume of shells that were fired, you can see some of the leftover debris near an army camp, was astonishing, so that a lot of material was left over for bored soldiers, some of whom who had been recruited from civilian life as jewelers or watchmakers, developed a pretty significant craft industry in producing these shells. In fact, when I went to visit family in Ireland, one of them had a carved shell casing that of the kind that you see here, that as you can see is very ornate and fairly easily shaped for decorative purposes. Edith Wharton, the famous novelist, wrote, "One of the artisans was just finishing a ring with beautifully modeled fawn's head. Another offered me a pickle hub, small enough for a mustard seed's wear, but complete in every detail, inlaid with a bronze eagle from an imperial pfennig, the penny of the German army, of the German empire. And there were many ringsmiths among the privates at the front. So a lot of talented people, and with talent of varying degrees, even made letter openers. And one of these letter openers, this one here, you can see was made out of the copper driving belt. Well, this revelation by Mr. Pommier, the curator, led us to the design of the 75 millimeter artillery shell. And it shows very clearly that our Norwood Cove object corresponds perfectly to the design of a 75 millimeter artillery shell. Here's the copper belt in the design and the copper belt in the Norwood Cove object. So having learned what this thing is, it brings us to the question of how did it get into a hole in the ground near, by Norwood Cove, near Fernald Point, the supposed site of the settlement. And it brings us to Christopher Lawler. See him here with Dick and General, his horses. He claimed to have found the object near the supposed site of Saint-Sever. Lawler grew up a short distance from Fernald Point in a community of Southwest Harbor and the island in general that believed the French mission was located there. He had access to trench art because he enlisted in the Army in April 1918 and served with the 301st Supply Train in France. He came home in 1919 to Southwest Harbor, married, raised a family, and managed an ice cutting and storage business. Some people alive today, he died in 1956. Some people alive today remember him as a guy who owned one of the last horse-hauled businesses. He would haul junk to the dump. He would haul ice. He would lead children around in his hay wagon. And he also, our friend Ralph Stanley remembers him very much as a practical joker, someone who was full of mischief. And when I published a version of this story a few years ago, Ralph Stanley called and he said, "I knew Christopher Lawler, and this sounds exactly like something that Christopher Lawler would do. Another resident of Southwest Harbor who remembers him described him as the jolly green giant of Southwest Harbor, a guy with a big personality. So if it's very clear then that Christopher Lawler gave this to the library as a joke, and he didn't have to add much. He probably did, knowing that he was a pretty talkative guy, but the groundwork had been prepared for many years to assume that the mission was located at Fernald Point, that in fact, maybe some of the impetus for identifying Vetromil's map as a relic of the point, and the people who told Vetromil that the barn ruins were once a wall 10 feet high, or that this is the Norwood Cove object is an implement used at the French mission of Saint-Sauveur. Maybe this was a way to add to the burgeoning tourist industry. And in fact, the national park went with this when they founded Acadia and were pitching, well, at that time, the Sour de Mont National Monument. When they were pitching it to Congress, they made the case that it was unique for its geographic location at the border of southern flora and fauna and northern flora and fauna species. And it was also historically significant. And that's why this French colonial era is emphasized in some of the architecture of the park, like the carriage road gatehouses are designed to look like maybe they came off a French nobleman's estate. And the park has adapted this location, even though it can't be proved where it is. Not saying it wasn't, but there's just no definitive proof that it was there. Well, I am happy to answer any questions you have about this episode, any thoughts you have on your experience of exploring Fernald Point or climbing Flying Mountain and looking down on this place. It tends to add to the mystique of this park, this association with a French colonial past. Now let me see if we have anybody on Facebook with questions for me. Or if you're watching on Zoom, I'm happy to take your comments there. I've been asked before why the park wanted to identify this place as Fernald Point. Well, part of the reason is that the historian Francis Parkman, as in Parkman Mountain, that was named for him, identified it as such. And Parkman was surely one of the most famous historians in 19th century America. And his word was as good as gold. It only is later that it began to be challenged by Canadian scholars who thought that the description of Bayard was probably more fitting to the Lemoyne area, especially since the text itself says the encampment was separate from Mount Desert Island. We'll never know. There have been archaeological studies of that location in Fernald Point, but most of them have been oriented towards Indian middens that have been on the shore. You know, there's another name associated with this. That would be Astiku, also as a name that doesn't also was a name that doesn't appear before Parkman's publication comes out in the 1860s. It likewise is drawn from Bayard's account and now serves as the location of the village of Astiku, right outside of Northeast Harbor, and the Astiku estate. So let's see. Parlez-vous français, Lyman? Well, was the big grassy hill known as Grand Prix? And parlez-vous? I do not know. I've not heard that in any of the associations I've made with in any of the literature I've encountered. But if you have something to add there, I'm happy to learn. I don't think we've seen the last of this. Let's see. Any other questions? We've heard legend of an unmarked grave on Fernal Point, Julianne Taylor. Yes, there is. For a time, there was a place identified as the grave of Gilbert Douthette, but the structure, a cross of any kind, is not there. But it is, I think it is somewhat doubtful. I think along a more feasible explanation for stories of an unmarked grave kind of goes along with why someone would identify the ruins of a barn as the location of the fortification. I think that might have been an attempt to make that location a little more interesting. Or maybe it was set up for fun. I don't know, but it has no basis that we have cause to believe. A grave, surely there were people buried at the site of Saint-Sauveur, more than Douthette. There were others that died, and Argall came back later to and actually hanged and buried some of his own countrymen. But we have no proof of a grave located there. I've also heard stories that there were holes dug in nearby Flying Mountain that were identified as potato cellars, but that's not plausible either, because the mission only lasted a couple of weeks. Surely not enough time to plant a crop of potatoes, see them grow, and then store them away for the winter. They just didn't have the opportunity to get that far. Let's see, any other questions? Well, thanks for all your kind comments. I hope you enjoy this. Next week, come back and we will follow up a little more with the story of Saint-Sauveur. We will have Boston College history professor James O'Toole come talk to us about how this event was celebrated in local culture well into the 19th century. Nat Fenton, you're raising your hand. Do you have a question for me, Nat? I should be able to see it if you put it in chat or Q&A. Meanwhile, Viking Meadow, Jane F. asks, where is Viking Meadow in relation to Fernal Point Road and Flying Mountain? I do not know. The Vikings were another story that had currency in the 19th century. There was a skeleton in armor found somewhere in Massachusetts that was thought to be that of a Viking. Later determined that it was more probably a honored Indian personage who was buried there. The skeleton and its suit of armor was lost in a fire, but thereafter there was a poem written by somebody very famous, I forget, Hawthorne or somebody like that, about the Viking. And thereafter, lots of sightings of Viking inscriptions, ruins of Viking longboats proliferated throughout New England. But I think they're more likely to just have a story that grew legs. And let's see, Matt, I'm trying to get to chat. Oh, great. So Nat Fenton tells us that Sugar knew Chris Lawler and rode his horses, Lady in general, when she was about 12 to 14, but knew him since her birth. His wife, Annie, made her biscuits. Chris gave her her first riding boots. That's fantastic. Thanks, Nat. You know, there is a Lawler Road that runs off Main Street in Southwest Harbor. If you see that, remember the Lawler family. Oh, and Pauline Angione asked, do you have a current view from Flying Mountain through the trees? Great to hear the story again. So Pauline, I only have this view. Let me get back up there. I only have this view. You can't look through the trees. I took it, this photograph yesterday. No, I want this one. And this really is all you could see. I took it yesterday hoping that after the leaves fell, we could see down through there. And it doesn't show well up in this image, but if you peer through or you go exploring a little bit, you can see that the view is the same. Right as you, if you go to the Flying Mountain parking area and take the steepest trail up the mountain, you will come across, you will round this corner and come to this site. You can see it's the same location. Well, I think that's all. I appreciate your watching. It's great to have you on our webinar. I hope I provided some distraction from current events so that you're not relentlessly refreshing Twitter. And I'll look forward to seeing you next Thursday, where we will interview Jim O'Toole. Thanks again for attending, and we'll see you next week.